Sarah.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Um,
I think to start, I'll invite you to stop the sharing of your screen.
okay. Um, oh, that's better. Thanks.
Perfect.
Okay.
Excellent. So welcome. So glad to see you, and hi to everyone out there who is participating in our webinar today. And those of you who are watching on the streaming, we're really glad that you're here to be with us. Those of you whom I haven't met before, I'm Rabbi Carrie Brown from Temple Sholom, and we're here with Sarah Levine. I'll introduce her a little bit more formally later. But we decided that we really wanted to take the opportunity to talk about family mediation and really these issues of family conflict that are parts of so many of our experiences living in real families, to look at them from a Jewish lens, and then really with a professional eye with the work that Sarah does in our community. So I thought I would begin just by opening it up by sharing a little bit about really how I see this to be very much a Jewish concern, certainly that all peoples is part of the human concern, but the way in which we approach this from a Jewish lens, I think is really, really important, and it goes way back. I actually remember when I was in rabbinical school that we had an exercise in our pastoral counseling class where we were asked to look at the Torah and develop a chart of the family systems among all of the individuals in the book of Genesis and Breshit, which I think there's actually something really powerful about. Our sacred text tells the story in many ways of the challenges of family dysfunction and family hurt and pain, and getting over that and dealing with kind of a lot of what's kind of layered upon generation. Um, and I found it to be really fascinating. And we can really glean so much of our ideas about forgiveness and repentance and change, and all of these values that we hold so dearly in our Jewish lives really apply to our families and our family systems, and how we navigate those relationships. It's really one of the honors of being a rabbi in a community, is to get to know families, and to help families when there are these moments of concern and tension, and helping to find some ways to work through them. So we're really delighted that Sarah is here. I wanted to share a little bit about kind of how our afternoon will work together today here. We are going to hear from Sarah and her presentation about some of her work and her experience, but we also want this to be interactive, to be able to ask questions. So those of you who are on our Zoom webinar, you'll notice that at the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A button. And that's a great place for you to submit questions for Sarah, or for me, but more for Sarah, I think. And you can do that anonymously. There's an opportunity to submit the question anonymously, and you can ask really anything. Sarah's happy to take kind of general questions, but also more specific cases and things that you're dealing with, to offer her wisdom to thinking about what different families are dealing with. So yeah, and please, if you have any issues with actually Zoom and how things are functioning in the chat, you can send a chat to Zoom Temple Sholom for technical support. So with that, I want to introduce Sarah. Sarah Levine is a member of Temple Sholom. She's been such an active and really significant person in our Temple Sholom community, in the greater Jewish community, at Camp Miriam and Federation. But Sarah is here today with her professional hat on. Sarah is a lawyer, a mediator, and a counselor. She works with families and individuals for all sorts of different occasions, whether mediating family issues, estate laws, and working generally as a counselor with families who are dealing with different life situations. So Sarah, we're so glad that you're here, and I'll leave it to you now to share your presentation with us.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. It takes me a minute, and it's a little. I have to do it in 2 steps. But before I do that, I just want to thank you so much for that introduction. I feel like the work is of that we all do. I mean, that people do when they work with a counselor, or just the work that we do in sorting out and working in families and getting along, is great work, but I love having it framed as Jewish and holy work as well. So thank you so much for giving us that context. It's great. So I'm going to just give me 1 second. Okay. How's that? Can people see my slides?
Looks great.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so hello and welcome. And I'm going to really echo what Rabbi Brown said about I have a lot of material. I have more than we can cover in the hour. So I'm really happy to have some interaction. I wish that we could all be in person because it can be so rich. But I'm going to give a background about conflict and the kind of ranges of ways that we solve conflict with and without third parties, with and without the intervention and the legal system. And then I have some sort of scenarios that have come up a lot in my practice, and I'm going to go through them. But I'm equally happy, especially if I go through the first one, and people have something that's arisen for them, or that they wonder about, that they think may be topical. I'm happy to try and engage with a specific situation that people want to raise. You'll sort of get a flavor of what kind of things I'm talking about as I go, but please, I'm not throw stuff at me, and we'll see if we can kind of have a discussion. So family counseling and mediation. For me, they are sort of on a spectrum. I'll lay this all out. This is my agenda and what I'm going to cover if we sort of go straight through my presentation. I'm going to give some definitions. What are family mediation? What is family counseling? When would families seek out family counseling or mediation, and which one? What can people who are going into a process do to help make it succeed or make it better? I have some examples of certain things that come up in specific family systems that I've seen in my practice that I'm going to go through and talk about, and I don't know, give some ideas, and I'll really encourage you to ask me questions about things that you're curious about. And then I have quite a bit of information about mediation. We may not get through it, and if we don't, I'm happy to send it out, in my slides and so on. So here's my rough diagram of possible ways to settle family conflict. They're not all great, but starting, the orange part of the diagram, I've made it the biggest on purpose. It really, if this were to scale, it would be kind of the whole slide, or virtually all of it. So self-management of family conflict. That's kind of what we all do all the time. That's like the relating to each other, as human beings and in our families. The with or without a family counselor, I'll get into that a little bit more. And then the other 3 are sort of as we move into the kinds of family conflict where legal issues would start to be engaged. And the thing that I think would come to mind first probably is divorce and separation and divorce. And that is, the biggest issue. And then there are others that I'll talk about. But that is sort of the spectrum of the most kind of divisive, and probably the hardest on families is going to the left. We're doing it we're using the Hebrew um, right to left. So a mediated settlement is, can be kind of the least high conflict way of settling a dispute that does engage legal issues. Then you go to court, and the issues are determined by a court order, which is more formal, more contentious, often more difficult. And then I always do sort of talk about, outside the legal and civil and legal system, there's violence and noncompliance. The court system has its issues for sure, but it does have that sort of far end, which you always want to avoid. So I think the takeaway here is it's always better to deal with things when you're in the orange if you can. So um, when is a good time to get family counseling? Again, the self-management of conflict without family counseling really would be way bigger than management of conflict with family counseling. Families who have conflicts that could become a legal conflict, so separation, the likely separation of a marriage, or if that is a maybe and can be sort of saved, obviously that's a great time. But even other kinds of issues that could become a legal conflict, trying to working with family counseling is a really good idea. Grief or a major change in the family situation, besides a death, a move, declining health of a family member, a major career change. I'm going to talk specifically about grief, but I feel, I'm going to make an argument that really, there are a lot of times that when people are grieving, family counseling can really help. Families navigating substance abuse issues. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not necessarily sort of talking about addressing the addiction per se. I'm personally not an addiction counselor. I think addressing addiction issues is positive and should be done. But I actually think that sometimes navigating that as a family, or navigating a substance issue in a family, can be a time where family counseling can help for the other family members.
Sarah's just a bit frozen. Can you hear us, Sarah? Give us just a minute. I think we've lost Sarah. Hopefully she'll be right back as she signs in again. Thanks for your patience. I feel like I should tell a story or something. Okay, we're trying to get Sarah logged back in, but in the meantime, I will share a little bit about one of those families in Genesis where we see kind of this layer upon layer of really family systems that are, um, creating the same sort of dysfunction from one generation to the next. So this a great example is the story of the character of Jacob. So if you remember from your Torah, Jacob was when he was younger, he was always in conflict with his brother, with Esau. And Jacob and Esau, they were vying for their parents' attention. That Jacob was always kind of held more in esteem by his mother, and Esau by his father, by Isaac. And the two brothers, who were twins, by the way, they were always kind of in this sort of kind of competition to get their parents' love. And Jacob, when his father was dying, when Isaac was dying, he tricked his father by dressing up as his twin brother Esau. Isaac was old and he was blind and he couldn't quite see, and he put some. Esau was known to be very hairy, so he put some animal skin on his arm, and he put on his brother's clothes so that he would have his scent and odor. And he went to his brother, or to his father, excuse me, for the blessing that should have gone to the eldest, even though they were twins, because Esau was born first. He was the eldest, and the eldest in Torah times, in that culture, had special benefits that came to them in terms of inheritance and blessing and such things. And so he tricked his father, and he lied, and his father gave him the blessing. But in the meantime, Esau got very, very upset. He was so mad that he said he was going to kill Jacob. And there was all of this tension in the family, so much so that Rebecca, their mother, told Jacob to run away, to go away because your brother is going to kill you. And he did. If we fast forward a little bit, Jacob goes, he falls in love with Rachel, the daughter of Levine, and he is ready to marry Rachel. He worked for 7 years for Levine to have the opportunity to marry Rachel, and we get to the wedding, and what happens in the wedding? Levine dresses up dresses up Leah, her sister, as Rachel. She's disguised, just like Jacob tricked his father Isaac. Now his soon to be father in law is tricking him. And there's all these issues of deception that are going on from one generation to the next. Of course, Jacob ends up marrying Leah, working 7 more years for Lavan, and marrying Rachel as well. This was in the times, different times of Jewish history when there was polygamy. And we have kind of this system, and it continues. And then Jacob himself is about to die, and his son Joseph, whom he loved and had issues of favoritism with. That was another thing that keeps going throughout these stories. Joseph brings his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to receive a blessing from their grandfather, from Jacob, the same Jacob who kind of stole the blessing from his father. He is ready to bless them. And as Joseph presents them, Jacob reaches out his hands to bless them, and he puts his hands on the boys like this. He switches. The dominant hand, which should go on the oldest child, ends up going on the younger child, and it's switched. And Joseph even says, "Father, you have it wrong. You need to do it the other way," and ends up switching back. And we can see that this whole type of
Mhm.
um, of trickery and changing. It kind of follows through the generations from one to the next. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
So glad to see you.
Um, Sorry about that.
That's no problem.
Um, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to actually, I'm trying to get my slides into somewhere where I can share them.
Sure.
But I think I'm just gonna. I don't think it's that critical. I think I'm happy to use my slides and just talk, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
That's great.
I was talking. I don't, of course, know exactly where I finished, but I was talking about what is a good time for families to get counseling, and I had talked about a conflict that could become legal, grief for a change, substance abuse issues, mental health. Um, did anybody? Why don't I just pick it up from there? Okay.
Yeah, we got through the
Okay.
mental health, I think. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then, I was just going to say day-to-day conflicts that leave people feeling hurt or defeated with a consistent pattern, where one family member feels excluded or exiled from the family. Um, Members feeling stuck in roles that really aren't working for them. Um, so, on the other hand, I don't want to, first of all, I don't really pathologize families who seek family counseling at all. So that's not, you know, I don't, that's not sort of the language that I'd use anyway. But I also want to mention that, there are a lot of family conflicts that kind of are reasonably healthy. Um, when if families are loud or families are expressive and not everything is an agreement, that's not necessarily terrible, especially where times of disagreements that don't feel great are followed by periods of warmth and connection. So, I mean, sometimes that can be hard for some people. Some people are fine with, loud and boisterous, and other people aren't. And maybe that's something that needs navigating. But I don't want to say that, all dynamics that involve sort of conflict are bad. Um, where they are, can be more harmful and create sort of lasting hurt is when it's the same thing all the time. It's the same person. Um, there's always, one person's viewed as the problem. The dynamic is the same, or where there are long periods of, real contention, and it doesn't feel like there's the kind of warmth and so on. And that's when it kind of can be time to check in and see how that's going for people. Um, yeah. So my next slide is, what are some of the drawbacks that people think of when they think of family counseling? I'm going to say perceived because, some of them I think, I mean, so the first one that I hear actually is that people have had negative experiences with counselors in the past. And I just want to acknowledge like that, that is the case. Not all counselors are great, and not all counselors are a fit for everybody. Family counseling is very human. It's a very sort of specific human enterprise, and I think fit is important. I'm going to actually get into some things, some ways that I think are good for people to sort of assess fit. But I really encourage people to be really open to the idea that they may have to see more than one counselor, and also what is not always known is at almost every agency, whether it's free, paid, or an EAP. Nobody really advertises this, but somebody can almost always get a counselor, go back and say, that counselor didn't work for me, give me somebody else. And often you don't even have to go back on the waiting list. So I really encourage people to, look for a fit and not be afraid if it isn't a fit. People have a belief that getting counseling can kind of make a small problem or not a real problem into a sort of big problem. And I think that, that has a risk of being the case, but usually, when there's something that kind of keeps coming up again and again, if it isn't dealt with through a sort of open, productive process, it kind of manifests with the family in a different way. There still is for sure a perceived stigma to counseling. I think that sort of societally, we've done an amazing job of bringing mental health issues into the mainstream and destigmatizing the, having mental health issues. And I think individual counseling has kind of, the stigma associated with it has diminished a lot. I don't know about family counseling. I think that some people really like to think, if I want to have a functional family, we don't need family counseling, and sort of interventions are for dysfunctional families. I think that not getting interventions sometimes is how you get to dysfunctional. And all the families are on a range of, all families have a lot, all of their issues. And, I don't really like to use the sort of labels of functional or dysfunctional. But, I think that's out there. I just want to acknowledge that. I think that some people have an aversion to kind of airing their dirty laundry with a stranger or sharing family secrets. And that's fair, and that's understandable. I think people, counseling is really very private and so on. So, I think people get fairly comfortable with that, pretty easily. And also it's very typical for some family members to be more comfortable with counseling than others. That often mimics the greater comfort in talking about emotions and issues in general. And counselors kind of have to be quite sensitive to that, to not, to adjust for that. But also, I'm going to talk about different ways to look at a family counseling process. And if people think that they want to talk about their issues, I encourage them to do that, even if it means starting on their own, because that's a break. I'm wondering if maybe...
Fantastic. We've got your slides.
Okay.
We're gonna
see how this goes. Okay, so we're on slide number 6.
Number 6, okay. Marielle's gonna put them in.
Okay. And a lot of them have staged, they don't all come up at once. And
Okay.
maybe she should just, not worry about that. Just bring all of the information up at once. My slides
Okay,
are coming.
I'll get my settings so that those go away, but you can keep going. Just don't, I didn't want to surprise you if your slides
Okay,
pop
okay,
up on the screen.
okay, okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so what counseling conditions make family counseling work? Everything I say, there's a million different responses. And so I'm just giving a few ideas. Safety, everybody has to feel safe. And if people don't, they have to have safety in saying that. And that's a precondition. And if that isn't there, it has to be adjusted fairly quickly, or it's probably not a great process. That's a real baseline. I would say, there are many different ways for it to look, and meeting with family members separately can work really quite effectively. It may progress to meeting as a group. It may alternate meeting separately and as a group, but there's a lot of power in a lot of different processes. So I don't think there's a formula to that. And I don't think meeting as a group all the time is always the best way to proceed, or, usually. I would say family counseling works best if it's counseling as opposed to the accomplishing of another agenda. For example, coming up with an estate plan, or figuring out how to, do a succession plan for a family business. Those things are really important. Those processes are, having a facilitator, is amazing. But those processes, as often as they kind of work with family dynamics, they bring up family dynamics. And the other thing is that usually those are driven by the agenda of some family members, which is, again, totally natural and fine, but it really does not have the same flavor of an open listening forum for people who often feel excluded. So, it's not family counseling in my view, or not quite. And kind of related to that, ideally, family counseling is not about imposing the views of some family members on others. And that's kind of related to, yes, great. Oh, my notes are there. Maybe we can just, that's fine. If we can get the bottom notes, I have my notes over here. So anyway, Okay. Anyway, ideally, it's not about imposing the family agenda on one member or defining, I'm going to get into this, but like if the stated problem is the problem of one person, usually a counselor is going to kind of work to adjust that so that it isn't, you know, it's not, you know, the problem with so-and-so's defiance. I mean, it may be, but to bring that person in, it's really hard if the whole family, you know, has a problem and it's that person and named as that person. So if there's an agenda, sometimes having some looseness and some flexibility. Yeah. So what do people bring into a family resolution process that can make it successful? I've moved on to the next slide now. So two things, I would say really flexibility about the process and some commitment to engage in the process. And I really want to, by commitment, I don't mean a lengthy, heavy financial commitment. And I told Rabbi Brown this sort of interesting piece of research that there's been lots of studies on what makes counseling effective. And there's quite robust research that people who make a counseling appointment or are put on a wait list for a counseling appointment find a lot of improvement in their situation in the interval between the time that they scheduled the appointment and the time that they went to the appointment, which, you know, I don't know what that says about actual family counselors, but I do think that's quite powerful in terms of what engaging in a process can do. And I don't think the research is quite as well defined for family counseling, but we do find that there's a lot of power in being in a process. And so if people don't want to get into like a long and expensive process, I mean, maybe stretch it out. You don't necessarily have to have a million appointments. Maybe have them over a period of time, because there is actually power to being engaged and to everybody knowing that they're engaged without necessarily needing to force it. A willingness to recognize one's own power in the relationship and the vulnerabilities of others. I'm going to talk about parents and adult children, and I'm going to actually address this in a little bit more detail. I talked about openness to conceiving the problem differently. And like bottom line, this is number one, a willingness to really, really listen. It is so powerful when people feel like a family member has really listened and heard them. Full stop. And it is interesting how that doesn't happen. That's maybe would be my number one thing if people want to just do something in their relationships at home. Really listen. So what does family counseling do that makes it improve family relationships? Okay, I'm apprehensive about even addressing this because it's like a master's degree, and every, you know, different counselors of different persuasions have very different approaches and takes on this. But I feel like I can't sort of ignore it and not even address it. So I'm just going to offer a few ideas. I find that my contrast with doing mediation, where relationships are really in trouble and kind of essentially over, and doing family counseling is kind of a nice, like there are things that I really, really do differently when we're working with healthy relationships that have a few stuck places and working with just resolving some property and so on, or even parenting. I think that counselors can sometimes see and identify the positive beliefs that people have about each other and the positive ways that family members have of relating to each other that they don't even necessarily see. And sometimes they can identify those and kind of build them up and accentuate them. Sometimes people have stuck issues. They have like, there are some relationships that sort of have existential issues. You know, I want to live in a rural area. My partner wants to live in an urban area. You know, things like that, where people kind of don't want to admit the good parts of their lives because there's always this kind of give and take on the these issues that are always a struggle. And sometimes counseling can make it safe enough for people to be able to acknowledge some of the things that they appreciate about each other, and know that they're not going to have to kind of give up ground on the things that are really important to them. Sometimes communication patterns that are kind of dug in and stuck can be sort of teased out and worked out. And good counseling can sometimes create a safe opening for people to be able to say what they need and enhance the connection. And there's lots more, but that's all I'm going to do. One, I'm going to talk about some dynamics, and the one that I'm going to address is, for now, is young adult children. People who know me know that I have young adult children, but I actually want to, the cases that I'm talking about and my, the phenomena that I'm talking about really are from my clinical experience. I worked at UBC Counseling Services, so sort of ages like 18, 19 to 28 or 30, and I'm going to use the words like child or children, but I'm really and truly talking about adults, and the things I'm saying don't really apply to adolescents. Other than that sort of late period of adolescence. So these are parents who are whose children are adults, and I'm only using that language because of their relationally. Just acknowledging that there is next slide, that there is a phenomena of kind of a delayed entry into traditional adulthood that is caused mostly by kind of the world economic forces, not in control of young adults, versus sometimes parents seeing particular traits of their own young adults that seem to contribute to that. And that's really common, and that's a mismatch that sometimes can be adjusted for. But I have some sort of specific examples of, okay, that's fine, I can see my own slides, that I encountered over and over and over again, where I would hear children talk about what their parents think, or just about their own concerns, and I thought, wow, like I'm sure their parents do not think that these kids think that. So I'm going to give a few. Without exception, every young adult that I saw was very, very concerned about their future, and that concern pervaded everything they did, daily, hourly. It caused stress, it caused depression, it caused, it guided their behavior. They thought about it all the time. And yet, they would, go home for visits, and they would say, their parents were grilling them about their future, as if, well, what are you going to, what's that, where's that going? How are your courses tying into what you're going to do? And the answer is they do not know, but it's not because they don't think about it. It's not because they don't care. It's just not that clear. And it stresses them all the time. And those questions kind of go to the heart of their own kind of core self-identity. They're very difficult to answer. And the kids would just shut down. And, the parents would get this sort of, I don't know, like, stop bothering me. And there would be a shutdown of communication that, you can understand. If the parents think the kids are just, have no clue, but that just was not the case. It was an overwhelm rather than a not caring. Parents of these students that I saw, many thought that their kids wanted the parents to kind of back off. And the kids did kind of want them to back off about, where are you going with this? But a lot of students wanted more. And I want to tell this story. I know I've gone on and on, but I had a student, a major depression. Parents didn't know about it. She didn't live at home, and wanted them to reach out. It just kept not happening. She didn't really want to tell them about her grades, which weren't very good. And she ended up moving, and they had to talk 2 or 3 times a week about logistics. Oh, should you get that bed frame from IKEA or on Craigslist? And when we have the car to help you, how's that going to work? And it cured their relationship. I don't think she ever told them about, she didn't do that great, but she passed the term and, she was going to, she talked about being afraid of talking to them about it. And I don't think she did, or at least she didn't in any, and their relationship got much closer from having these conversations about really trivial things. And those conversations about trivial things really lead to the deeper conversations. So the kids want that. I wish my parents would call me more, but not, but kind of understand that they really care about what they're doing. Parents having confidence that their kids understand their values. I mean, oh my goodness. I didn't have any Jewish kids that talked about this, but I had kids of all races and backgrounds, many, many, many first generation immigrants with very, very big conflicts in their values with their parents. But it wasn't because they didn't know what they were. And when the kids would express to me, I'm dating, but my parents want me to have an arranged marriage, they understood. And the way that they dated was different than they would have had they not known about that. And they struggled and struggled, but they really understood what their parents' values were. So I think that, and again, they would feel like, when I go home for a visit, all they do is say, you don't understand what we think. You don't understand our values. They do, but they're navigating them in their own kind of world. And parents learning to understand how much power they have in the relationship. I'm going to, again, I could go on about this example too. The kids that I saw who felt so guilty and beholden to their parents who were helping them financially with university. And, sometimes parents are making big sacrifices, but sometimes I actually asked, I said, is this help that you feel so bad about, like causing, your family to, suffer financially? Well, I mean, no. And yet so guilty, so beholden, and the sort of exertion of that power sometimes. I don't think the parents understood that they were exerting power when they were. But negative comments that I'm sure parents think are nothing just land very, very hard. And as the kids get older, I don't know if it lands less hard. I think parents have a lot of power. So that's what I have to say about young adult children. Now I'm going to go on to another
question.
Yeah.
So I just, when you were talking about young adult children and you brought up the term guilt, which, is a big thing, certainly in that situation, but I think it's a big thing like overall in these family conflicts is guilt and expectations and things like that. Do you have any like just general thoughts about how to address guilt in these family systems?
I think that often the people don't realize how much guilt the other person feels at something they've said. So I think, again, kind of open communication. Like if the person feeling guilty could ever say, I feel really so, I know you guys are helping me so much in school. And when I don't do my very, very best, I feel so guilty. A lot of parents, I think, would say, that's not our intention here to, make you feel guilty if you get a B. Or, or even if you fail a course, like it's not about that. So I think that opening I think that a lot of the times the guilt is felt in a way where it's not really intended to be imposed. And if that can kind of be opened up. And I guess also if somebody says to somebody else, I feel really guilty when this happens, I think that the person, again, that sort of goes into what I'm saying about recognizing your power and whether you want to exert it that way, and recognize how much pain that it's painful to feel really guilty. I mean, I feel like, I don't know how the other parents feel, but I'm helping my kids financially with university, and it's like an honor and a privilege. And I want them to be grateful, but this has hit home to me that I think if it gives me an opportunity to say, I don't want this to be making you feel guilty.
Mm-hmm.
that's not what it's about. So I guess just recognizing and I want you to like have the conversation. I mean, yes, you're lucky. Yes, it's privilege, but it's a privilege for me. I want you to take it seriously, but it's not about guilt. I mean, I think that would relieve a lot. I think for these students, it would relieve a lot of the guilt.
Mm-hmm.
So creating an environment where people can express that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll think of something else maybe, but okay. I kind of want to pause. I might just stop just because of where we are at in time. I might not necessarily get into the grief. I mean, the main point what I was going to say is, a lot of conflicts happen when there's a death in the family, and grief. There's been a bit of damage done by this sort of model of grief, the 5 stages, which is pretty. I don't want to say it's totally discredited, but it's very, very modified, and there's not a real picture of what grief typically looks like or should look like. But a lot of times grief manifests as anger and anxiety. It's easier to feel anger than it is to feel really, really sad. And so family conflict can really, arise out of that anger and grief. And I do think if people can seek some help, whether, it's from whoever, you or counseling or somebody, and assuming that the grief is really struggling and making them struggle, that can probably avoid some real damaging issues. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that conflicts arise on death, but I just think that, that's kind of the main point there.
Mm-hmm. We did have one question, Sarah, from
Yeah.
the audience. This is actually going back to the young adults.
Yeah.
That's okay. About, how, so if the kind of academic success is, kind of worrying a lot of these students, how much should we as parents be asking about that? If we don't ask, is it saying we don't care, or is it putting pressure on to keep asking about it?
I think it's putting pressure on to keep asking. I think that like every university student knows that their parents want them to succeed academically. I mean, maybe some don't. I would say, in general questions, how are you? How was the term? How are you feeling about your classes? Kids will talk about it when they feel comfortable. I just don't, I think that if you have it in your mind, don't ask, you'll kind of still ask. It's really hard to never ask. So, and I think that kids will tell you. And I think it gives them, I think you can just say, I don't know. I mean, I think less questions and more just being in the same space where they can talk about what they want. And trusting. That's a big, I don't know if I said that. Trusting them, just really trusting them to care about themselves and to care about their own future, and conveying that deeply, that I know that you care so much about what you're doing. Like, I know this is important to you. And then you give them the autonomy. Most times you'll know how they're doing. They'll tell you, or if it's comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's my, people feel differently, but that's where I'd come down on that. Okay. So I think I've kind of gone through, ways to choose a counselor. One thing I was going to say, I won't go through all of this, but recommendations from, I mean, a lot of people seek counseling online, like go look to online sites that, I don't know. I mean, that maybe that would work, but I would say if you know any counselors, most counselors get asked for recommendations, and so have a list of referrals. So, if you wouldn't see your friend, but most counselors will have a list. And the rabbis also, I think, are able to facilitate that. I think I talked about, other, we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to skip through this. Oh, I am going to talk about cultural considerations. That's my next slide. So I would never say that you need to have a counselor who matches your cultural your sort of religious background and so on. But I do think that if these things are an issue in your relationship and an issue and they're a source of kind of conflict and discussion, if the counselor has a particularly sort of strong position, that can often be a problem because people who share the counselor's view, the other people might feel ganged up on. So if these things are big parts of your dynamic between you, I would test them out, because I think that, there does need to be some alignment, or at least some acknowledgement by the counselor of, where there are things that don't, like religious background, for example. I would say, if a counselor is like super, super anti-religion or very religious, and that doesn't match, or that's that's more of an issue as opposed to like whether they're Jewish or, not. But I would feel pretty comfortable putting that stuff right out there. I think it's really important to have comfort with that. Okay, I think I'm just going to do a really brief discussion. Maybe we could go to slide number 14 about mediation, because I'm just doing a little comparison about what the difference is and mediation and family counseling, because I said I'm doing family mediation. So mediation gets engaged where there's a matter engaging with the legal system. So two big headings there are division of property and assets, or money essentially, and the care of a person under a legal disability, and that's terminology for anybody who isn't of age or has competency due to mental disability or other infirmity. So that's an adult or anybody who needs care. Same as with a counselor, a mediator can have a facilitative style. A counselor can be more facilitative or quite directive. Some counselors really tell people what to do. Mediators can be facilitative, where it's about kind of coming to encouraging the parties and helping them come to common ground, versus, if you go to court, like this is what's going to happen. So, and there are places for both, for sure. Mediation, like counseling, can work in plenary and shuttle. Are the terminology for plenary is all of us are in the same room together, both sides. And if there are lawyers, the lawyers. Family counseling, also, you can have the entire family in the room, or you can work with the mediator going between the different parties. Now, actually, with COVID and Zoom, mediation has gone, we still can do Zoom with everybody, but it's way, way, way more shuttle. And there's quite a lot of, it's not too bad. The shuttle is seeming to work and does sometimes really create a more safe environment. Mediation is future, it's really focused on short-term agreement, where it's cooperative and where parents are not super high conflict and they're looking to, correct and work together. There's some orientation, but it's mostly focused on agreeing on things. Family counseling is really future relationship oriented. Yeah, I mentioned when the legal system gets engaged. I have some terminology about mediating separation and divorce versus other relationships, but I'm happy to send that out. Mediators have to be neutral. They can't be biased. They can't give anybody legal advice. They sometimes mediators will require people to get legal advice and at certain times and so on. And also the cultural considerations I also would kind of raise them, not so much, in religious background, but like LGBTQ relationships. I think that, I've mediated a few LGBTQ relationships, and I definitely get interviewed for those. And I think that that's for, the level of comfort with me as a mediator. Similarly, I think parenting styles, like if people think that the mediator, believes something strongly and that's a matter of conflict, I would try and flesh that out. I have lots more, but I think I'm kind of, diving down a deep hole of mediation. And there's lots more information in my slides. So maybe, I mean, if there are any other questions, or if there's anything that you'd like to ask.
Yeah. So, I mean, one other question did come up from the group that I'll share. That you might have something to say. It might be something. It's about Judaism too, so I might
You can take
jump
that
on
one.
this one as well. But someone who asked about when her husband says, "I'm not Jewish enough." What does that mean? How do we? And I think it's about expectations of what is like enough, and what different family members think is the right way to be, and how we expect those things to come to fruition. So I don't know if you've had that
Okay, well, I mean, I would sort of ask, like, what does, I mean, it's really what you just said, like, what would it look like if your family was Jewish enough?
Mm-hmm.
And hear that. I mean, and then over to you. I
Yeah.
mean, I'd go
I
from
mean,
there.
I think every Jewish relationship, um, and I would say every relationship with Jews a part of it. Sometimes this might be even in an interfaith relationship, um, but all the same for a relationship where there are two Jewish partners. Um, what does being Jewish look like? People come in with different understandings of that, and some of that comes from the generations before and families and those ideas. But sometimes too, I think it's about like um, our our own sense of who we are as Jews, like it's reflected on the other person, and a lot of that does come into play. I think from my perspective as a rabbi, when I talk to families about this, people concerned that my children or my grandchildren are not being Jewish enough. They're not, engaged the way that I want them to be or raised them to be. I think a lot of that is about, well, I think that most Jews have a very positive sense of Jewish identity. I think, we have kind of the old Woody Allen character of the self-hating Jew, and I don't think that's really what most Jews experience. I think most Jews are very proud to be Jewish and express our identity in very different ways. But I think, kind of what does it mean to be Jewish enough for us as a family, and work that out, and how our household looks, and what the experiences of if there's young children in the house, or holidays and celebrations and things like that. I think those are really important conversations to have, and so, sometimes maybe that does need facilitation, but often I don't know that it does. I think it's
Yeah.
just about speaking honestly and listening to each
Yeah.
other.
And I would sort of, if I were, with him, say to him, like, what would that look like? Because sometimes you hear that and you keep trying to do more of what you think, he wants, or to make it Jewish enough. He's like, no, it's not that, it's this. You think, well, that would be easy.
Hmm.
So sometimes that can be a really nice conversation that, it's like, oh, well, okay. But when the conversation has some pressure on it, and some kind of there's can be a lot of emotional sort of triggering. Not, I don't know, triggering is too strong a word, but sort of and you sort of, everybody gets into that, and like, well, wait a second, I'm trying, and you are trying, but sometimes there a reflection, as you said, about what does that look like, because it
Hmm.
looks different for everybody. Maybe they don't know, maybe he doesn't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
we've finished our hour, which is
I know.
amazing.
Sorry
um,
about my glitch, but
no, that's okay. We worked through it, and yeah, thank you so much for all of your insight, Sarah. And I think looking at all of this in those kind of, that's the spectrum that you talked about, the ways in which we can work through conflict and issues within a family. There are lots of different ways to do that, but it seems that providing opportunities for that listening and that sharing and the recognition of the dynamics is so key.
That's great.
Thank you for your great work.
And thank you for the Jewish lens that just really kind of touches me about doing the work with that backdrop.
Excellent, excellent. So, if people have other questions, can they email you or get in touch with you?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So if you need Sarah's contact information, let us know. If you want to have the slideshow shared with the
I'll tweak it a little bit and
Okay.
I can make it available for sure.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Thank you all so much for being with us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.